Welcome to our second meeting. Welcome back to everybody who was here last time. I'm excited to get into the structures conversation because it is going to be a little bit different than what we talked about last week with mindset, but equally important and just as fun. So I'm going to have Meredith take the roll call first, and then I'll go over what we're going to do kind of today with our agenda, and then we'll get into it. So Meredith, take it away.
Amy Tracy, Tom Thompson,
Present.
Mary Taylor,
Present.
Claude Christian,
Present.
Reagan Satterwhite,
Present.
Jenny Larkins,
Here.
Tina Brogel,
Here.
Shara Savage,
Here.
Carla Tipton, Sharon Robinson, Steve Trimble,
Here.
Audrey Gilbert,
Here.
Melissa Jenkins, Zachary Clifton. Hey, Chair. You do have a quorum.
All right. So today we're going to just talk about structures primarily within accountability. We can keep in mind what we talked about last week with our mindset conversation, but today really is that technical side of things, structures, what we want to see, what potential things could look like, anything like that. But before we get started, I do want to talk about and address a few questions from last time about kind of our purpose here, what the end goal is, how that's all going to work. So as I talked about last time with audience and who we're really talking to, it's a flexible answer. It sounds a little vague, but our audience is continually moving. So we are a KBE work group, so we will be directly talking to the Kentucky Board of Education, but because we're all here representing different stakeholder groups, we are responsible for responding to the needs of those groups to an extent. So that kind of addresses the question of who are we responsible to, who are we going to be talking to, addressing in this conversation, but also our general purpose. We're going to come up with some value statements, recommendations, things that we want to see done and pursued by the Kentucky Board of Education. So taking information from our last meeting about mindset, taking information from our meeting today about structures. We will be compiling all of that, and in our next meeting, really sitting down, synthesizing that information, and coming up with kind of a clear and concise way to report back to the Board of Education what we've learned, what we've talked about together, and what we think that they should pursue. So it will be some form of document. We will discuss that, I think, a little bit more, not next week, but the following. And I'll definitely send out a few emails in the interim, but I hope that that addresses the questions. And if anybody has any more questions about the clarity of our purpose here, please speak up now. All right, cool. So like I said, today we are going to be discussing accountability structures, and I sent out a few different resources about a variety of structures, kind of some conceptual ideas about what that could look like, not necessarily anything too specific, but just ways to get us thinking about that. But before we really get into a conversation about what we want to see change, what we like now, all of that, I would like to ask Jenny Larkins to talk to us about what our accountability system looks like now in Kentucky. So she's going to give us a high-level overview just so that we're all familiar with it, or if we're not familiar with it, we just kind of have that base going off of it. But thank you, Jenny, and you can take it away.
All right, thank you, Audrey. Is it okay if I share my screen? Because I thought that
Yes.
I would use the accountability at a glance document that's posted on our website. Because it's got some visuals in here, I think that'll help us walk through it. And again, as Audrey said, I plan just for a very high level overview because we can really get into the weeds on this, and I know we don't want to do that. But the system that we have right now is a lot due towards because of Senate Bill 158 in Kentucky. But above that, we have federal law that we have to follow. And the federal law that guides us in our accountability system is the Every Student Succeeds Act. And it requires that we have a state accountability system, but it also puts a few guidelines in there, such as that it must have multiple indicators. So we can't just evaluate schools on, we couldn't just evaluate high schools on graduation rate, for example. We have to have multiple indicators, and that those indicators must have weights attached to them. We'll see that how we have that in the system, and that the states can decide those weights, but the weights for academic indicators have to be much greater than weights for non-academic indicators. We have to use measures that are valid, reliable, comparable, that kind of thing. And then we're also required to identify the lowest 5% of schools in their performance. And then we have provide support to those schools. So those are kind of, that's kind of the framework that the federal law gives to us. But then Kentucky, through Senate Bill 158, which passed in 2020, it added some very specific requirements to the accountability system. So the first specificity, I guess, is it spells out the exact indicators that we must use. In fact, it even calls this list of indicators exclusive. So we can't add to these indicators, nor can we take away from these indicators. Each school is measured on these indicators. There are 6 total. All 6 of those are used at high school. There is no graduation rate or post-secondary readiness at the elementary and middle schools, so they only are evaluated on 4 indicators. You'll see that the first 2 are the content areas that students learn, so reading, math, science, social studies, and writing, and those indicators are measured by the state assessments that students take in those content areas. If a school has English learners, then they are also evaluated on the English Learner Progress Indicator. We get data from that through the English proficiency exam that those EL students would take. The quality of school, post-secondary readiness at high school only gives students options to demonstrate that they are post-secondary ready. So they can demonstrate that through academic measures, such as through meeting benchmarks on the ACT, or they can meet career readiness through just a variety of options like industry certifications. There are some work-based learning that have been added recently. And of course, we have a lot of career people on here from OCTE that can help if anybody has questions, but lots of options for that. The quality of school climate and safety is given at all 3 levels, elementary and high, and that is measured by a student survey. So perception data, as you see there, how the students perceive their school environment. And then finally, graduation rate is an indicator that is included at high school. And we use the 4 and 5 year graduation rate, the average of those 2 at high school. So those are the 6 state indicators that we use to evaluate schools. Now I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of this because I think it makes more sense to talk about it in this way. So each one of those indicators at each school is evaluated for status, change, and then they'll get a combined result from the color. So let me back up for a minute and just say that this will be the very first year that we will be able to implement this accountability system completely. We have not had change yet in the system because we had COVID interruptions and students not testing and so on. So this is the first year that we will have 2 full years of data. So we can finally implement that change component. So for each indicator, the schools will receive a status, score, and label. So it might be, for example, medium in the current year. Status is current year performance. Then we will look at the current year performance compared to last year's performance, and that will give them a change score and label, such as maintain from prior year. And then finally, those two will combine, and where they intersect, so if I have medium and current year, maintain from prior year, where they intersect is yellow. That school will receive an indicator performance rating of yellow. Now, of course, all of these will have numbers behind them. And those numbers are important because we are required to apply weights. So once we have an indicator score, an overall score, then we have to apply those weights to come up with an overall accountability performance rating. So as you can see, each one of those indicators has a different weight in the system, and they are combined using those weights. And then the school receives an overall, of course, number will be there, but then they receive an overall color. So we have cut scores to determine what number classifies the school as an orange or classifies them as a green, and so on. But it's not the color that determines the bottom 5% of schools. It is that number that they get. So there will be an index score. Again, we have to identify the bottom 5% for CSI, TSI, ATSI, which is basically a way of saying the school is going to get some support from us, and it's either going to be comprehensive, so school-wide support, or it will be targeted to student groups who are performing as low as the bottom 5%. And so after they get those, once we have all of this, then we populate the school report card with all of this information, because we are required by law to inform parents and other stakeholders about how schools are performing. So all of that information will go into the school report card, and it will be reported for schools. Districts also will have a page where things will combine, so they'll get a performance level at the district. And then this will be for all students. And then we also report information on the individual student demographic groups. So again, that was very high level, and I know I went through it pretty quickly. So I'm happy to answer any questions anybody may have. But again, I think the most important part to just remember for our conversation is that everything that we're doing is required by either federal or state legislation. We don't at the department decide to add other things to it. So changes that we make will also have to include legislative change.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Does anybody have any questions for her, or just ways to start our conversation off around this in particular?
Thank you.
All right. I was using my teacher wait time there, but I've heard lots of people talk about and need to learn. All right, so for our conversation today, like I said, we're going to be discussing structure. And now that we have that context about where we're at right now in Kentucky and why we have the things that we have and what they look like, I really want to ask, what do we like about our current system and what do we not like? Just anything that you've experienced in your offices, in particular for our KBE staff, anything that you've experienced from a stakeholder level, or anything that you just saw right now. What do we like, not like, are confused about, anything like that? Yes, Dr. Robinson.
So the thing that I like about our system is that it does have multiple measures. And I like that we are clear about the indicators, the exact indicators. And I do believe that we give some guidance to the intervention, the subsequent intervention that might be, that needs to be addressed by a school system or even a school. So those are some things that I do like. What I don't like is that it's not dynamic enough. It's not, I don't think that what the guidance that we can give really does help districts or schools target interventions to really support instruction. I don't believe that our system informs subsequent professional practice in a way that really could be useful. And I would love to see us use this information to leverage and support change rather than result in the blaming and shaming that usually follows the report of the state results. So I think that's not a fault of the system per se. It is a challenge to us to figure out what we do with what the system produces. So, this is, I don't believe that anybody owns the system. I think that most people who are doing work in classrooms at the school level and even at the district level do not feel a sense of ownership that this really does represent what they do, their sense of priorities, and their even their embrace of the indicators, if you will, that suggest to them this is the work that we do. So I feel as though it is perceived and it acts as a kind of top-down thing that's delivered unto us rather than something that is an important source of data and information that we can use to support the learning of our students.
I really like that. And I really like the part about ownership because I can say that so far in my educational career in K-12, I have not felt that ownership over the system. It feels like something that's being done to us, not done with us. So I very much like that. Anybody else? What else do we have to say about what do we like and don't like about our current system? I will say we mentioned that we do have a lot of OCTE people here today. So if we want to hear if they have anything to say about what career and technical education looks like under the current system, that would be helpful, or anyone else.
Audrey, I'm going to jump in. This is Tina.
Mhm.
And it's not about the Office of Career and Technical Education, just in general. I think maybe one of the reasons we aren't having a meaningful or deep conversation about what we like or dislike about the current accountability system is because we haven't actually seen it in action, given, the fact that we haven't seen consistent data. And I think that if we have some stability in the accountability system so we can see that consistent data for a few years, and then like it was previously mentioned, use the approach of what are we going to do about the information that we get from this accountability system, and how can we correct issues that may exist. And so I know, at least for me, having that deep, meaningful conversation about the parts that I like or the parts that I dislike, I'm going to need to see some consistent data, and then see how the schools approach adjusting their approach to their school district-wide or at the local school, to see how we can maybe help. That assessment really needs to come for a few consecutive years before I feel like I can talk to that point.
Yeah. And I think that puts us in a tricky spot, um, where we have ideas, but we just don't really know what we're addressing right now. Very good point.
Hey, Audrey, this is Reagan. I agree with Tina. I think one thing that I might like to see is maybe a limit or a restriction set on when changes can be made to the accountability system so that we do have that comparable data from year to year. I know that the accountability system has not changed greatly since COVID, but in the world of career readiness and career and technical education, we have certain indicators that have, and even those slight changes make it difficult to compare last year to this current year and so forth. One being that there was the added measure this year of a new indicator, or actually it came in 2022 with Senate Bill 59, the work-based learning was added as an indicator of career readiness. And so that is a great deal of students that would now earn that indicator. And so that is going to make the data look differently. Any student that's in a cooperative course or an internship now counts as a career readiness or for career readiness if they've earned 300 hours. I wish the KDE had a little bit more control over that. We were kind of restricted with the legislative language in that we weren't even able to add a minimum grade level to those co-ops or a grade to the co-ops
Yeah.
and internship courses. Is if students pass that course with a D, then they're post-secondary ready. And I think everybody on this call would agree that, I wouldn't feel comfortable putting a stamp of career readiness on a grade of a D. Secondly, the dual credit indicator was changed. It used to be that students had to pass 2 dual credit courses with a grade level of C or higher, and that's been changed to just 1. So I think, putting maybe a guardrail around when that can be changed so that we compare it from year to year. And then I guess maybe if we could have a bigger voice, a larger voice in what that looked like. OCTE has a lot of engagement with employers. And when we say that a kid is career ready and a kid gets to an employer and says, wait, this kid has a check mark, or, they've been deemed career ready, but we're not seeing it here. And then we get that on the flip side from those employers. Another piece is just that our school system, not every school district does this, but a lot of school districts have a one and done mindset. I think we mentioned this on the last call, that if you've got your check box, if the student has a check marks, then they're good. You've gotten them to that benchmark. Whereas I would love to see an accountability system where every indicator of career readiness or post-secondary readiness counted, so that the student could build upon those post-secondary measures.
Yeah, and I see that in the chat from Mary. She talks about how last week we talked about that one and done mentality and getting to that point, instead of getting students multiple credentials. And she thinks that it would be more beneficial for all, that the more credentials a student earns, the more that credit that school will get. So really continuing that growth, not just stopping at a benchmark, but making sure that those students are pushed further and further and they keep having goals to reach. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I saw, Tina, you had your hand up a little bit ago.
I was actually trying to give Reagan applause, and apparently my mouse and myself are not working well together. So I'll just clap for Reagan when, she was talking earlier. It was a really good point. So sorry about that.
No, I like it. I appreciate that. And I bet Reagan does too. I think we've had a really solid discussion about this, but also given the conversation that we had a little bit earlier about how we don't really have a lot of experience with this system yet, so it's kind of hard to comment on what we like and don't like. I think we can move on to talking about what we explored in our pre-reading or just things that we know about from other systems. So considering our mindset conversation from last week and things that we've read, what would some ideal elements of an accountability system look like for us? Anything that you know about that you just thought of today? What would some ideal elements look like?
This is Tina again, not to be redundant, but I will just jump in where I was trying to give Reagan some claps. I think that, in my opinion, an ideal accountability system would have a set amount of time for which we were going to use to gauge. And I don't know what the magic number for that is, 3, 4, 5 years. If we had some stability in the fact that there wouldn't be changing variables, it's just very difficult to compare apples and oranges. And so I think that was the point I was trying to applaud for Reagan when she said, it would be really nice if we had that opportunity to create stability in the process. So if we do it this year and these are our numbers, then, what can we do different next year? And then we would have some actual tangible data at the end of the next school year to compare. And I just don't really think that we've had that yet. So I would have to throw that stability or consistency in as something I would like to see.
Yeah, that's very important. Tom, you have your hand up?
So I don't know. I don't know that you can do this, and it's probably come up in the past, but I really feel like if you could do post-secondary, 3, maybe 2 or 3, 5 years out to see what success rate they actually have and give schools points for that. And I know that that's weird, but I'm just thinking that there would be some kind of component, maybe just a piece of it for students' actual success, not whether we think they're ready to be successful, but where they've actually either gotten a 2-year degree, 4-year degree, or they're employed, gainfully employed for, a set amount of time.
That's interesting. And I always like the comments that start out, I don't know if we can actually do this, but I would like to see that. Because that really shows the thinking outside the box. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, I see a hand up and I can't really tell where. You can just go ahead and speak. Oh, Claude. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I was going to add on with what Tom has said as far as the looking at what's going on after high school. That's actually a part of the federal accountability measures where they're looking at what students are doing 2 years and 4 years out, actually initially 6 months out, whether or not they have actually gone on to college to work, military, and so on. That's where they're looking at follow-up. So there's evidence that they are career ready, not just a guesstimate, because as Reagan mentioned, some of the indicators that we're using, one dual credit course, or I believe it's 300 hours of work, almost regardless of where you work, is not an indicator that you'll be successful afterwards. So having the opportunity to look beyond that and see what's actually going on. And we talk about whether or not, when we talk about post-secondary readiness or being successful post-secondary, I've joked about it at times that it's whether the student has gone on to work, gone on to college, or if they're sitting in their parents' basement planning parties. There's a difference. Even though we may have said, this kid is post-secondary ready, what evidence is there that it's been followed through on?
Yeah, and I think a really interesting way of doing that could be valuing those local partnerships with business and industry, with post-secondary institutions, really seeing what that connection between the schools and those options post-secondary, what that would look like and how we could measure using that. Very helpful. Dr. Robinson, I see that your hand's up.
Yeah, one of the things that I think, on the last point, just building on that last point, I would love to see us engage the participation of local business and in a process that either that could begin with an analysis and deliberation about what do we do next regarding what we already test and a system that we already have, but also introducing at the local level a kind of performance assessment system that involves local citizens in helping to jury some of those performances and begin to introduce at the local level some engagement in contemplating the implications of the results that we have that recognize the work. I mean, I think about the L3 districts and the work that they're doing, the work of the districts that are involved in several initiatives that introduce different kind of instructional procedures that will produce different documentation of student performance. And how do we get them into the process of creating an organic system that will allow us to be more accountable for the visions and the aspirations that we have for improving the instructional process? So I guess I'm saying, you know, while we contend with what we have mandated by state and federal law, I would like to see us begin to support and acknowledge the productivity of the work that we're doing to enhance the vibrancy of the student learning experience, to be more accountable for that as a process, and to fully engage the community in owning that work, the work that we already have to do because of state and federal law, but the work that we aspire to do more and more on behalf of more rigorous student outcomes. It is, you know, I keep thinking, how do we change while we are in a box that is, I don't know the value of efforts to try to change that box through legislation and all of that sort of thing. But we do have a pretty dynamic level of local work that we somehow should support and, you know, just really hold up through efforts to document the outcomes of these efforts as well.
And thank you for that, Dr. Robinson. I think that circling back to that local conversation, kind of like what we had last week, but also what we're hearing from the field, where they want their work to be valued because they don't feel like they don't want it superseded by state requirements. That's really valuable. I do want to highlight what Reagan put in the chat. She said, I would like to see communication to the public around who and how, not to be cynical, but the changes to the accountability system are legislated, but it's not the General Assembly that typically gets the credit or the criticism for the changes. And specifically, I think she's talking about like how the department's the one, or that falls back on schools for how that's being measured. So very important. And I think that communication piece also loops back to part of our mindset conversation about things that we just need to set straight. We need to clarify to the public in order to have that conversation and in order to be more fair to some of our schools. And then Andre also put something in the chat. I might recommend that at some point, looking at the problem from a data engineering and governance perspective as well. What data would be needed for the kinds of analysis that we need? How would they need to be shared between districts and KDE and made mutually visible? And what mechanisms and protocols currently exist and what would need to be created? And that'd be a very important conversation for our next meeting, to make sure that we include all of those things in our recommendations, in our value statements, and what we want to see the board pursue going forward and how that should go. Meredith put in the chat some of our conversation from last week, and I think it's a valuable conversation to have still now, what this looks like in our current system, how we could incorporate some of these elements in an ideal system, and what that could look like, putting some more local value on things. So using that information, let's proceed with, what do we want to see? What do we see now that doesn't align with what we talked about wanting to see last week? Also, Mr. Trimble, I saw you go off camera a few minutes ago, so if you want to jump in.
Well, I was just going to add something. I was listening to Claude there, and I don't know, Audrey, if you're familiar with the ACES program. I believe that is a program where the students build their portfolio as they go through their high school career. And I don't think all the school systems have this, but a lot of them do. And not only does it keep up with what's going on with them now, but it also follows them after graduation and see how they're doing, what they're doing. And I think that shows true success after graduation. What have you done to prepare yourself, and did it work? So I think if there's some way, and I know it's hard to do that, and we're talking about years down, 2 or 3 years down the road, maybe, or longer, but I think true success will show after they graduate and what they're doing. And I think this ACES program can help do that. And I don't know if we can incorporate that some way into our assessment.
Yeah, that would be really interesting, I think, to learn about. I've used that program. I used it once as a pilot program, about building portfolios and seeing how that can be customized for my district and our situations. And I know that there are several districts out there that use that. So being able to see what they did in high school and how that follows them after high school, that would be very useful. I do want to highlight what Claude put in the chat. Can we find a true way to go beyond achievement and acknowledge a student's accomplishments derived through our education system? Essentially, achievement is the completion of a task imposed from the outside, the reward often being a path to the next achievement. Accomplishment is the endpoint of an engulfing activity chosen by a student, whose reward is a sudden rush of fulfillment, the sense of happiness that rises uniquely from the absorption in the thing outside ourselves. While we cannot measure happiness, something like this would give meaning for the students. And I think that's very valuable. So Claude, if you would like to expand on that, you can. If anybody else would like to comment on that, that would be very helpful.
Essentially, what I'm saying is finding a way for it to actually have meaning to the student. As you said yourself, a lot of times it feels like it was something that's done to you. And many things, and I've had this conversation with folks when we talk about CTE. I don't interact directly a lot of times with the teachers, but I do interact with the folks who do the data, and I do pass that information on. When we talk about career counseling, for example, it's a matter of asking a student, what is it you want to do today? Because it may change their mind tomorrow. But if we're helping that student get somewhere they want to go, and then looking at whether or not they've achieved their goals, then you have a much better chance of them accomplishing the things that they want. It actually does feel like an accomplishment as opposed to a requirement. I have to take this test. I have to pass this. I have to get this far. Whereas kids, I'm generally, a kid will go through hell and high water for something they want, period. And if you find out what they want and help them get there, points mean nothing. Every school would actually achieve at ridiculously high rates just by simply helping the kid get where they want to go, instead of telling them where to go. Because quite honestly, as a teenager, if someone told me where to go, I would do the same. And I wouldn't be very nice about it, nor would it be someplace they wanted to go. So why not help them? Those of us who are parents do it for our own kids every day. Our kids decide they want to be a musician and say, "No, what? I want to be a fireman instead. Now I changed my mind. Now I want to be a doctor." And while we may think it's silly at that given moment, we will still help them get there. But within our educational system, we're locking them down the very first time they make a decision. At 13 years old, what they're going to do with the rest of their lives. That's not fair to the kid. It's not fair to the system, and it's certainly not fair to the teachers who are being held responsible for getting them where they don't want to go.
Yes, thank you so much for that. I think that from my own experience, that's very true. And I think that using like inquiry-based programs, that's been really helpful for me. Some of my teachers have guided me through that, saying, well, what do you want to see? What are some things that you value? And then how do you measure that? How do you get experience in that? Those have always been helpful experiences for me. And you got a yes in the chat from Tom, so very enthusiastic. And Dr. Robinson, I see that you have your hand up.
Well, I just want to say amen, amen. You know, as a teacher in the early days, before performance assessment was even thought of, one of the questions that I would always add to every exam, to the end of every project, was, what more do you want to learn? Ask a question. What question do you now have? And that had not occurred to you before we did this unit or did this work. And that gave me an opportunity to engage with individual students about their interest, and to kind of cultivate and nurture that sense of being responsible for what they learn next, rather than have the system be simply for credentialing, as Claude said, for achievement, you know, only to go to the next achievement, which may be related, but it may not really link and leverage and help students be aware of how they become learners. So I'm just wondering if, as an aspect of an accountability system that really does support learning, if we could somehow, as a KBE, work to help folks kind of link this process, this big behemoth called accountability, with that real big imperative called learning, and help the teachers in the classroom see how this relates to their professional aspirations and goals and fulfillment, and to nurturing student learning. I mean, we've got this thing out here that just looks like such a straitjacket of, you must do this. And it carries such, it's a threat on the horizon, and not a process that kind of supports a dynamic that has to be locally and personally owned in order for it to happen. So, I'm just thinking how we can, when I say dynamic, I mean dynamic in that it really does support learning. When I worked at ETS, I used the term assessment in the service of learning. And I'm going to now say accountability in the service of learning. And I was fortunate to see examples like the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards come into fruition. And every teacher that goes through that process will say this. They will say, I learned in the process of this engagement with assessment. When you get that out of an assessment or accountability system, that should be the gold standard.
Yes, thank you. And I think that taking those practices, like you said, from that professional level that we're expecting of adults, that we're expecting out in career fields like with teaching, and bringing those into our classrooms could be very helpful. And it could be like it is a real world experience, just maybe scaling it down so that it's comprehensible for our students. And that if that's how we're measuring teachers, if that's how they're reaching their next level, then why can't we measure students that way? So very important. Thank you. And then Meredith said in the chat, Dr. Robinson is perfectly highlighting this mindset. Does our current system value becoming an expert learner? Does it push you to become the next best thing, the next best version of yourself? very important. And Andre put in the chat, essentially you would want an accountability system in practice to incentivize and lift up the most powerful learning, instruction, and assessment practices that support the aspirational humanistic goals for students, caregivers, families, and communities, which is in line with United We Learn. So, and I've heard a lot of our different United We Learn themes and statements in our conversation today, both word for word almost, and just in ideas. So very helpful. I do want to shift in our last bit of conversation here to looking at that local aspect. That was something that we talked about a lot in our conversation about mindset, what it would look like if we valued local accountability, instead of looking at the big capital A accountability, looking at lowercase a, what that looks like, boots on the ground, how that could function. So what would that look like? How could we shift to that system? Should we shift to that system? How could we put that into practice? Yes, Dr. Robinson.
I really do believe that through United We Learn and some of the other initiatives, those folks who are working with us on modernizing assessment and the L3 districts and so forth, I wonder if we could support them in helping to create a local voice of demand and an assertion of local autonomy and authority. Let's say local authority to be accountable for what we wanted, for what we care about most. And add that as a dimension of their work. And I know that, you know, the folks at KBE probably are like cringing because it's a hard job doing what we have to do under state and federal law. It is more than a full-time job. And now we're talking about work that would support districts in going above and beyond and in kind of a different mindset, if you will. I mean, there isn't a law that says we can't do that for local districts yet. So I'm just wondering if we can, as we support these groups in their work, if the KBE staff could help us encourage them as they document what they do to kind of organize themselves as a little skunk works or a group that is working together to be accountable for additional information in a way that is valid and reliable. And I mean, this would involve things like little big things like training people who are going to evaluate performance data, to be and setting up scoring rubrics and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's the same kind of stuff that you have to do on kind of the testing that we are already overly familiar with, we know, but the data are different and they come in a different form. And so how do you become confident that the feedback from that form of data is just as rigorous and valued as the data that we are already more familiar with, overly familiar with. I mean, it's just the notion of, I do believe that this ownership at the grassroots is very, very important to school improvement. And it's very important to it's very important to support these voices so that the ownership is really authentic and becomes a dynamic that leads the voice of change in policy that we might want to see ultimately.
Yeah, and I like that we keep circling back to that ownership, because that's really what we're doing here. We're trying to take ownership and responsibility for the system that we have and the future of the system that we have. So Dr. Robinson mentioned the workload for KDE staff and what that could look like under the system. So if we could hear from someone from KDE about what that kind of change would look like, what you would change about local accountability, or just your perspective on that in general.
So Audrey, I am going to try to speak on behalf of the Office of Continuous Improvement and Support, of which I am not a member. So be warned, I probably shouldn't do so. However, I do know that they value, because they are the group responsible for helping those schools that are identified as CSI, ATSI, TSI schools. They value continuous improvement for all of our schools, right? So
Yes.
they in no way say, oh, if you're not below this line, then we will ignore you. The hope is that, as we said, was valued in our conversation last week, that all schools are moving toward improvement, right? That even if you are deemed high achieving and high performing on whatever the assessment system is at the time, that shouldn't just be then a signal to stop improving and to stop analyzing and evaluating the experience of students and your system to see where you can improve, right? That is just one indicator, and that you should use that to inform where you go next, and that we should always be in this process of continuous improvement. And so I think that is something that we want to be sure is not lost in how we communicate about the accountability system. Certainly heard from many on the meeting today that there is value in not having dramatic shifts to the system every couple of years, because it makes it feel insufficient or as a not very useful tool. However, I do think that we do value having an opportunity to sort of check in with our districts and to make sure that we're providing support for them and that we are challenging them to always be considering what the student experience is.
Thank you. And I think throughout this, I've heard elements of really measuring that local improvement, which our Office of Continuous Improvement and Support really does. Using CSIPs and CDIPs as that evaluation tool, they set those goals and then they measure where they fell in terms of achieving those goals or accomplishing those goals. So maybe that could be something that we look at in terms of a local measure there. Using CSIPs and CDIPs to just track where we're at, take those a little bit deeper, use districts who are really utilizing those plans to see what we could do with those. So thank you for that reminder about OCIS, Meredith. Anyone else, as we have about 3 minutes to close out before I give our next steps? Anything on any parts of this conversation? See, Andre put in the chat, it might also be helpful at some point to think about the issue not just as unified global systems change, but rather as changes that allow more meaningful engagements with different kinds of schools and different profiles and needs. Very helpful. Thank you, Andre.
You know, as I think about this work, that's absolutely right. I think if I were trying to describe the KDE role of the future, it would be a role that really supports, as Meredith said, that a dynamic accountability system by providing the tools for it, ranging from the assessment required by state and federal policy, and additionally tools to document the aspects of learning that we know to be important based on the kind of school, the kind of educational experience, the kind of standards, such as expert learners, such as being really career ready, really a engaged citizen, really those things in the portrait of a learner, and so that the KDE is a really strong technical advisor, consultant, partner, collaborator, and I think it would make the KDE work just as dynamic as it could be. We've got a lot of talent, and I think we've got a lot of I feel like the commitment to continuous improvement, as Meredith has said, is just unassailable. It is definitely there. And I suspect we could make this happen. But, it's easy to say, and it's not easy to do. And so, but it does kind of inspire what we've done inspires a vision in my thinking of KDE being a collaborator across the whole spectrum of accountability based on what schools need. And we've done a lot to inspire schools and districts to, up the game, up their vision, get beyond where we are to where we want to be, acknowledging all of these outcomes and having these important outcomes serve as an aspect of the student learning journey, credentialing at certain milestones, but also inspiring subsequent learning.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. I think that's a perfect note to end our conversation on today. So I'm going to put our exit slip in the chat between now and our next meeting, which is not next week, but the following. I believe it's the 30th. Yeah, I believe it's the 30th, again at 8 in the morning. We'll be bringing all this information together, really working on those recommendations, value statements, whatever we want to come out of this process. I will be sending you some emails in the meantime about what it is that we want to see about outside of that. And it really helps if you fill out this exit slip. So thank you very much. And I think we can end a minute and a half early. There you go. A minute and a half early. But thank you all so much for coming today and contributing.
Thank you.